Welcome back to Coffee with the Callers for our third episode this morning.
That's right.
This morning we're going to be talking about the Offertory. As you recall last time, Padre, what did we talk about last time?
Well, last time we were talking about the liturgy of the Word, and we brought that to a conclusion. Now we're beginning to talk about the second major part of the Mass, the liturgy of the Eucharist, which begins, of course, with the Offertory.
So, as you know, every time we have Mass, we finish with the Creed, and then the priest sits down, and the deacon goes up on the altar with all the altar servers and starts preparing the altar, and usually the choir will sing something. And of course, while that's happening, the collection is taken up. And this is an important part of our church because, of course, you know, you can't run the church without the resources to run the church. And so this is everyone's opportunity to enter into a biblical understanding of their relationship with God. And of course, we know that that comes from the Old Testament. When good Jewish people would go to the temple in Jerusalem, they would go at least once a year to worship God and to bring a tenth of their earnings to God. So, of course, as you know, Father Doug, the next thing that happens is that we actually get people from the assembly to bring up the bread and the wine, and those represent the fruits of our labors, no different than they did with the Israelites in the temple in the Old Testament, but also they bring a portion of that collection, that tithe, up to the altar. And again, what's the first thing that the priest says when he comes around the altar with the bread and the wine and that money? He says, "Pray with me, my brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours will be made acceptable to God, the Almighty Father." So this is so important that if someone is actually coming to Mass and they're not making a sacrifice to be at Mass, well, they're somehow missing out a part of what it means to make sacrifice to God. And we come out of our Jewish roots into our Christian reality. We don't lose that sense that really worshiping God must be a sacrifice. It can't be a convenience. It has to be something that actually challenges us. So as soon as the priest receives those items, then he goes deeper into this offertory rite. And Father Doug, what are some of the things that you think are so powerful about this rite?
Well, then in part of the offertory rite that comes next, when the priest takes the bread and wine up to the altar, he says some prayers that are said silently. They're said by the priest in a low voice, but those prayers sort of elucidate what's going on in the liturgy. So over the bread and the wine, first of all, the priest says a blessing. And he's blessing at that point, not actually the bread and the wine, but God. The prayer starts, "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation." And then he says, "Why? For through your goodness we have received the bread we offer." It's our gift, but he begins by recognizing that even this gift of bread that we have to offer to God is already God's gift to us, that we're returning to him, that we're offering back. And then we wind up receiving it again in communion. There's this back and forth between God and man. There's another prayer that the priest says there that you don't hear out loud. He says that after the bread and wine are on the altar, he bows down and he says, "With a humble spirit and a contrite heart, may we be accepted by you, O Lord." He's echoing there the words of the 51st Psalm. So we recall those words as we come to the altar, as we prepare to offer our sacrifice to God. And we ask God to give us that humble spirit and contrite heart. The prayer goes on to say, "With that humble spirit and contrite heart, may we be accepted by you, O Lord." In other words, we're bringing ourselves to offer and sacrifice. And may our sacrifice this day be pleasing in your sight, Lord God.
So as soon as the priest has finished his silent prayers at the altar, he turns and he has his hands washed by the altar servers. So Father Doug, what's the symbolism of that actual part of the rite?
Yeah. Well, the priest says another little quiet prayer while his hands are being washed. It's, "Wash me, O Lord, from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin." So the idea is that if we're going to approach the altar, we need to approach it with a clean conscience. And we're approaching God here to offer sacrifice. So if there's something in between us and God, some sin that we need to let go of, we need to let go of it before we approach him here. We were talking about that the other day. At the beginning of Mass, there's a penitential rite as we're approaching the altar. And then to remind us of that again, the church has the priest wash his hands, which is a symbol of purification from sin, so that we approach the altar with clean hands. And when the people see that, we need to be thinking, what do I need to be purified of also in order to offer a pleasing worship to God?
Exactly. So this is the offertory rite, and we hope that this helps you to come to Mass on Sunday and have a new and a refreshed encounter with God through this beautiful part of the liturgy. So, Father Doug, what are we going to be talking about next week on Coffee with the Callers?
So next week we're going to move into the very next part of the Mass that follows immediately on the offertory, and that of course is the great Eucharistic prayer, in which bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ and a perfect sacrifice is offered up to God.
So join us next week. Oh, before we leave, Father Doug, I've got these delicious cookies. I picked these up at Central Market today.
They look like fine cookies.
Well, they're actually caramel and white chocolate. I'm going to offer one to you.
Thank you very much.
Delicious. And of course our coffee, my coffee mug, I don't know if you saw this or not, but it says distretto, which is the Italian word for distress. And then it says here, adjective, intense feeling of anxiety experienced upon realizing that there's no coffee left in the house.
That's one of the more intense forms of anxiety.
Yes, you would have distretto
You would have
if
much
that was the case.
distretto.
So join us next Friday at 10:30 on our social media channels as we continue talking about the Mass on Coffee with the Callers.